Saskatchewan became the first province in Canada to ban private sector sale of alcohol during the Prohibition era, but the rules weren't as strict as they were south of the border. That meant bootlegging to our U.S. neighbors. But did Regina have speakeasies with American gangsters hiding out? Well, Warren James has been looking into Regina's Prohibition era. He'll be hosting a Heritage Regina lecture at Bushwhacker Brew Pub tomorrow night. And he has a YouTube channel called The Gallows Canada. But first, Warren joins me now in studio. Good morning, Warren.
Hi.
So, Warren, set the scene for us when Saskatchewan decided to ban private sales back in the Prohibition area.
Well, what had happened, it's actually quite a long story. The author James H. Gray says that whiskey fueled the West and kept the West in a turmoil between 1870 and 1920. So most Western cities, starting in Winnipeg but moving west to Regina and Calgary, had a real problem with public drunkenness. So the initial movements towards prohibition was more a movement towards temperance. And what the initial people that were in favor of prohibition wanted was basically the saloons to be dealt with. And there were two problems with these bars. Number one is that's where, and this, to me, this was unbelievable when I found this out, that's where people cashed their paychecks. Because most people worked, and back then it was pretty much all men, most men worked till 6. The banks were closed at 3 or 4. So the convention came that you cashed your paycheck at the bar. And back then, people were paid by the month. So that was problem number one. Problem number two was the custom of treating. And I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but treats. I give you a treat, you give me a treat. So the convention was if when you cashed your paycheck, you bought a drink. And you had to buy a drink for anybody that came with you. And then the convention was they had to buy you a drink in return. So you can imagine what happened. Guys were blowing their whole paychecks for the month in the bar. There was drunks all over the place. So what they originally wanted to do was get rid of the saloons. So the first temperance people in Saskatchewan, what they wanted was for the government to establish a local option law so communities could decide whether they had alcohol sales or not. But then World War I came along, and as the war, people thought the war was going to be over by Christmas 1914. It wasn't. As the war dragged on, there became a movement that, we really shouldn't really be wasting foodstuffs on alcohol, and we really shouldn't be having a lot of public drunkenness when there's men at the front. And there was also the idea that saloons were where foreigners were plotting against British Canada. So they really wanted to close the saloon. They really wanted to have prohibition, but that put Premier Walter Scott in a bind because he needed the votes of the social reformers, plus the votes of the many Germans that lived in Regina, and they were totally against the prohibition idea. So he came up with a compromise, and the compromise was dispensaries, which was the first government liquor stores. So they came in early 1916, I believe it was. They put at that time, believe it or not, there was 406 bars in Saskatchewan,
Wow.
which kind of blows my mind. So anyways, they had 23 dispensaries, but then the war continued to drag on and on and on, and eventually they had a vote for prohibition in Saskatchewan. Now, one of the really interesting things about prohibition here is that's very the opposite of the states. When under the Volstead Act, the National Prohibition Act, the whole of the U.S. went dry. And I read somewhere that was because they wanted to coordinate all the different state and local laws and get them under one umbrella. That's not what happened here. Saskatchewan could declare prohibition, but it couldn't close distilleries or breweries because they were under federal legislation. So what initially happened was you got what they called mail order houses, where if you and I are here in Saskatchewan, I can't sell you a bottle of whiskey. But if you're over in Manitoba, I can sell it to you and I can mail it to you. And if I want a bottle of whiskey and you're my buddy over in Manitoba or a business over in Manitoba, you can send me a bottle of whiskey by the mail. So this basically booze is going back and forth across the borders anyways, despite the prohibition. So there was a lot of pressure on the federal government, and they finally passed legislation that meant that you couldn't import booze if it had more than 2.5% alcohol, which put that out of business.
Mm-hmm.
But then, and this was something the Harry Bronfman got into initially, booze was still available through drugstores. So, because they viewed booze as medicine
Yes.
back then. During the Spanish flu epidemic, some drugstores in Regina were writing 250 prescriptions a day for alcohol. So Harry got into that business, not only supplying out like liquor to drugstores, but also supplying alcohol to the people that made patent medicines, because a lot of those were pretty high. So then the idea of these order and councils by the federal government that kind of established national prohibition, they were to end 1 year after the end of World War I, which turned out to be November 11th, 1919. And at that point, they could have declared national prohibition, but Quebec didn't want it. They wanted to sell wine and beer. And not only were there senators from Quebec against it, there were senators from out west that were against it as well. So their compromise was that if any province voted for prohibition, they could stop the flow of booze over the border. But it took so long between the time that the end November 11th, 1919 to October 1920, when all these votes and publicizes took place, the mail order booze trade started all over again for that time period. And Saskatchewan voted to go dry, so that meant no more importing booze. But by that time, the United States had gone dry, and there was no law against exporting it to the United States.
Okay.
And that's when the real big money kicked in.
Warren, we'll have to leave it there. You have much more on this at the lecture tomorrow at the Bushwhacker Brew Pub. They're always great lectures. This is hosted by Heritage Regina. This happens at 7 o'clock, and it's titled Sober Stories and Tipsy Tales from Regina's Prohibition Era. Warren gave you a great preview there with us. That's at 7 o'clock at Bushwhacker, and this, of course, is free. Thanks so much, Warren.
Okay, thank you for having me.
You're
It's a
very welcome.
privilege.